Je déclare cette réunion ouverte. Bienvenue à la réunion numéro 57 du Comité de l'agriculture et de l'agroalimentaire. Je vais commencer par quelques rappels. La réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule salon, une formule hybride. Les délibérations sont diffusées sur le site web de la Chambre de commune. Colleagues, I'm going to ask the room to quiet down a little bit. We've gotten started here. Quiet up a little bit, would you? A titre d'information.
Just so you're aware, the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee.
We're continuing, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the motion adopted on October 5th, 2022, food price inflation. I want to thank all of you for coming a little bit early. We have expected bells and votes tonight. I have talked to everyone. When the bells start at 5:30, I'm going to try to go no more than, it will be no more than 15 minutes, but just to make sure the second panel can get done, we're going to extend with your consent, which I'm told is going to be forthcoming. Thank you. And we'll make sure that we get the second panel in to the extent that we can, and then we will go off and vote, and we will not be coming back to this room once the vote's done. We will be done. So with us today from the Association québécoise de défense des droits des personnes retraitées et pre-retraité, Pierre Lynch, President.
President Pierre Lynch is here.
Hurst, who is the Executive Director. From the Global Institute for Food Security, my understanding is we're still having a bit of issue with Ms. Koch, but if she can join us, it's Elena Koch, Chair of the Board of Directors from GIFTS, and from Food Producers of Canada, Denise Allen, President and Chief Executive Officer. So we're going to dive right into this. I'm going to start with Mr. Lynch. You have up to 5 minutes. I will be very strict on the time, unfortunately, because of our constraints today, but you will have 5 minutes, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you, my friend.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, Vice Chairs, and members of the committee, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to take the floor today to talk about inflation, and more specifically about food price increases. Before I get to the heart of the matter, let me briefly introduce our association, the Quebec Association for the Defense of Retired and Pre-retirement people. We currently have 30,000 members throughout Quebec, divided into 37 local chapters. We have given ourselves a mission of defending seniors, but above all, of highlighting the living conditions of the most vulnerable. We cannot talk about food inflation and the exceptional context and situation we are going through without talking about those for whom these price increases represent a huge part of their monthly budget. My speech today is about giving a voice to the most vulnerable seniors. In Canada, there are two main benefits for seniors: the old age security, which is universal, and the guaranteed income supplement, which is income tested. Understandably, seniors who receive the GIS are among the poorest in the country. The poverty lines in Canada are based on the Consumer Price Measure, or the CPM. The government sets the old age security and GIS levels based on this measure. The problem with this threshold is that it is not high enough to live with dignity. Seniors are faced with heartbreaking choices when dealing with the housing crisis, high prices of medication, and increasingly expensive food. It is also important to consider that the typical consumer basket for vulnerable seniors does not contain the same things as the standard basket. Thus, a CPI, for example, of 5.2% in February 2023 will not be enough to compensate for the 10.6% increase in the price of food, which is double, and which represents a large part of the consumption basket of vulnerable grocery baskets of vulnerable seniors. Indexation is not instantaneous. Between the moment of the price increase and the actual indexation, which is done every 3 months, there is impoverishment. We would like to raise awareness of this issue amongst the public and Canadian chains. On the one hand, unreasonable increases leading to excessive province is the equivalent of taking money directly from the pockets of the most vulnerable seniors and concentrating it in some of Canada's largest fortunes. On the other hand, I invite the committee members to consider in their analysis the disproportionate effects of inflation on basic commodities such as food, and to also question the notion of a price cap on the cost of food, as well as indicators of poverty. The CPI and the CPM are important indicators of poverty in Canada, but they are not the only ones that do not allow us to define acceptable poverty lines if we want our seniors to come out of poverty. We believe that the federal government should develop a new sustainable income indicator and revise its definition of poverty so that old age benefits allow everyone to live in dignity. In conclusion, the issues of food inflation are, of course, rooted in the complex relationships between producers, processors, and grocers. These supply chain issues are essential to understanding the problem, but we also need to look at the uneven downstream impacts and consider ways to better support vulnerable seniors. In the meantime, let's hope that the more affluent who have a role to play in rising food prices realize the precarious situation of fellow citizens and demonstrate a renewed sense of civic responsibility. Thank you for your attention.
Cool.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. Now we will move on to Mr. Whitehurst.
Good afternoon. I'm Ken Whitehurst, Executive Director of Consumers Council of Canada. The Council is a not-for-profit working towards an improved marketplace for consumers in Canada. Thank you for your invitation. Canada's consumers face difficulties. They are worried about prices and supply of goods and services, feel manipulated by business and unprotected by governments, worry about those less fortunate than themselves and the hidden costs of deprivation. The Council's focus will vary from what you've heard so far. Our submission does not seek to pinpoint the causes of food inflation. Let's explore how governments and food retailers can soften the negative impacts of temporary food inflation using regulatory and other tools, and how to prepare for the future. Canadians are now much more aware of global, national, and local food supply risks. Improve the safety, security, diversification, and productive capacity of domestic food sources. Consumers feel gamed every way they shop. Raising food prices by offering less product for a similar price, shrinkflation, is common. Unfortunately, consumers are 4 times more likely to notice a price increase than a package size decrease. This practice erodes confidence in retailers, producers, and government. Make it easier for Canadians to shop. Mandate unit pricing like other major countries. Quebec is the one province that regulates unit pricing. Start by adopting nationally its rules and improve and enforce them. Consider our report, Unit Pricing, Time for a National Approach. Council has noticed eroded consumer protection enforcement. Health Canada's and CFIA's comprehensive inspections to detect misrepresentation and substitution are all but gone. Current risk-based enforcement methods are inadequate. Consumers cannot themselves identify food adulteration, short weight, substitution, uninspected foodstuffs, misrepresented origin, non-approved irradiated food, misrepresented retail meat cuts, or repackaged food with fudged, packed-on dates. Please protect consumers when they cannot protect themselves, especially with prices rising sharply. Because every cent counts, ensure price accuracy is at checkout. Over 20 years ago, the Competition Bureau worked with retailers to introduce a scanner price accuracy code. Consumers are supposed to be compensated for inaccuracies, but this program relies on consumer vigilance, and most don't know it exists. The code is based on a fantasy. It expects a consumer, accompanied by small children, with a cart full of groceries, to examine each item scanned and remember the shelf price. And then, if a difference is noticed, to inform and educate the clerk. sometimes to debate with a store manager. Retail Council of Canada arbitrates disputes. Finally, this does not guarantee the problem will be fixed. Include the code in government surveillance. Regulators require regulators to be alert to incidents of non-functional slack fill. Section 9 of the Consumer Packaging and Labeling Act prohibits deceiving consumers about the quantity and quality of what's inside a package. Health Canada and the Competition Bureau conjointly could administer Section 9. The Council told Measurement Canada's consultation on trade measurement that consumers need action to get what they pay for. It recommended consolidating federal responsibility for the accuracy of net quantity declarations on packaged consumer food and general merchandise. Canadian Food Inspection Agency is supposed to ensure net quantity for food products, the Competition Bureau for general merchandise. Neither agency makes accurate weights and measures an enforcement priority. The Bureau has not carried out net quantity inspections for 2 decades. Measurement Canada inspectors visit retailers to verify scale accuracy. They could also verify net quantity and unit price declarations and price accuracy. Food insecurity raises the question, who within the federal government represents consumers at the policy table when issues like food inflation and security or consumer protection and safety arise? The Council felt encouraged when in 2019 and 20, the Prime Minister mandated 3 federal agencies to create a Canadian consumer advocate to oversee complaints in the federally regulated telecommunications, transportation, and banking sectors. The Council supported this and recommended the advocate promote consumer interest in all sectors. Recent letters don't mention this mandate, but the Council learned through access to information that Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada proposed expanding it. 2 House of Commons petitions with signatures from every province and territory support this. Petitioners await the government's response. A consumer advocate would provide a center of expertise for House of Commons committees seeking expert witnesses. The Council supports the establishment of an independent federal advocate with the sole function to argue for consumers, support their voice through civil society, and stress the relationship of consumers' needs to the decision-making processes within agencies of government.
Thank you, Mr. Whitehurst.
You've been told your search.
Sorry.
You've been told your search for. Yes, I'm sorry. I stumbled at a moment. It's a tight presentation. You've been told your search for the sources of food prices inflation is complex, but these are straightforward measures to show Canadians that Parliament has their backs when they go shopping.
Thank you, Mr. Whitehurst. We'll now turn to Ms. Allen for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for your invitation to appear on behalf of Food Producers of Canada and to discuss the important issue of food price inflation and its effects in Canada. I am Denise Allen, President and CEO of FPC. We are a national industry association representing small and medium-sized enterprises whose primary business is the manufacturing of value-add food and beverages. I am also a member of the Industry Steering Committee, whose directive is to design a proposed retail code of conduct, which is a first for Canada. FPC has a proud 30-year history and a strict mandate of advocating on behalf of Canadian owners, investors, and leaders of food-based businesses. Despite the operational challenges and economic headwinds we face as an industry, we remain firm in our belief that we will work collaboratively to protect Canada's domestic food supply and that we will continue to build capacity and attract investment. As Canada's agribusiness industry, we represent more than 8,000 manufacturing facilities, many of which are the single largest employer in rural communities. Our industry employs more than 300,000 people across Canada, making ours the largest manufacturing employer and an essential part of Canada's economy. As a key link in our national food value chain, food processors are the largest purchasers of farm gate output to which we add value and sell both domestically and abroad. Food processors represents Canada's an internationally recognized and respected brand of safety and quality on the global stage. As the world continues to struggle with climate change and post-COVID recovery against a backdrop of armed conflict, shifts in social demographics, insufficient international development aid, a return to isolationist politics and nationalistic policies, a global economy facing rampant inflation, supply chain disruptions, and resulting increases in food costs, reliable estimations are that 1 in every 4 humans are now faced with food insecurity. Food security has become one of the principal issues of our time and is even more pronounced in our northern and remote communities. Many of these factors exist globally and are exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. Subsequent pressure on energy and fertilizer prices resulting from geopolitical conflict, the prolonged occurrence of these factors has contributed to an environment of broad-based price increases at all points of our food value chain. In addition to sharp increases in manufacturing inputs, FPC members are reporting an additional financial burden in the form of interest rate increases and debt servicing. For many of our smaller players, increases have forced the deference of planned investments in innovation and automation, further reducing their ability to effectively compete. Further, our competitive environment has been greatly restricted by over-consolidation in many sectors. Therefore, I want to note that the food industry is not alone in this regard. Consumers are living with those unintended outcomes, specifically in grocery, telecoms, and banks. With 5 major retailers now controlling more than 80% of the Canadian grocery market share, suppliers currently have little to no recourse when faced with escalating fees and fines. Working relationships and the culture of our industry has been strained as fair and transparent business relations are difficult to achieve without the principles outlined in the proposed code. Our industry is working diligently and collaboratively with all stakeholders to launch the proposed code, which we will believe will add greater contractual certainty and improve supply chain efficiency by setting forth trade rules and a mechanism for dispute resolution. It is critical that the code be implemented and adopted by all industry stakeholders. With respect to the Competition Bureau and the Competition Act, I would like to note that FPC applauds Minister Champagne for his call to action for Canada's Competition Bureau to look deeper into the issue of food inflation and its root cause. We would like to encourage the modernization of Canada's Competition Act and challenge the outdated belief that bigger is better, which was reflective of the business philosophy in the 1980s when the Act was made into law. An overhaul of competition law is taking place in other jurisdictions, notably in the US, where President Biden recently stated that, quote, competition has weakened in too many markets, end quote. We would like to highlight that in addition to the review and modernization of the Competition Act, the other longer-term policy changes hold opportunity to lever Canada's abundance of natural resources. While other countries are faced with resource scarcity, in part due to climate change, Canada represents an opportunity to feed the world in the coming 50 years. We have water, land, fertilizer, feed, energy, and people. Our policies must now align with good economics, which will ensure that we are competitive, make it easier to invest, and further develop export volume in commodities like chicken. Consumers pay much higher prices in Canada than the rest of the world for chicken and other commodities like eggs and turkey. In summary, there have been significant efforts made to outline what our government can do to improve business conditions necessary to protect domestic food supply. Many of my colleagues have appeared and added their voices of support for the code and the need to enhance our competitive ability. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Allen. Now, colleagues, first of all, a couple of housekeeping notes. Welcome to Mr. Davies and welcome to Mr. Savard-Tremblay in place of Mr. McGregor and Mr. Parent. The bells, as I understand it, are going to be about 5:40. So if I do my math, that would be about 50 minutes per session, which leaves about 30 minutes for questions. My goal as your chair is to do 5 minutes each party. And then we're going to go to 5 minutes of the Conservatives and Liberals, and that'll be about 30 minutes. So that's how we're going to approach this. I'm going to start with the Conservatives. I think, Mr. Barlow, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your insights into this study. Ms. Allen, thanks for being here. And I just wanted to ask, you were talking about the impact interest rates are having on your members. I'm just curious, a lot of the study and the conversation has been about excess profits and, grocery CEOs and those types of things. But I think it's a little short-sighted that is the sole reason for food inflation and the impact it's having on Canadians. For your members, what impact is higher interest rates, higher input costs, higher fuel costs, higher transportation costs? I'm assuming, having to pass those costs on to consumers. What impact are those issues having on your members and thus the price at the grocery store shelf?
Thank you for that question. FPC members are reporting a multitude of impacts that are directly related to rises in interest rates and debt servicing. Access to capital has been restricted. It's very difficult when a business owner is looking to invest in plant and equipment or innovation or measures that enhance food safety and have a trade-off between those investments and having to pay more for virtually every expense line in their business. So in relation to being able to absorb those costs and pass them on to the consumer, that's not always possible. Many of my members are bound by trade agreements that don't allow immediate effect of price changes. Also, we're bound to a cycle of retail operational times of the year as well. So it's normal for a blackout period to exist around Christmas time that prohibits any price changes. So we are bound by those trade agreements. We're bound by all of the cost increases by inputs, trade-offs within the business. And all of those are pressuring producers' margin and our inability to reinvest in our business. So it's difficult to draw a straight line. The environment is very complex, but in effect, it is prohibiting investment and it's making us less competitive every day. And in closing, to answer your question, to put it in real terms, I hear from a member almost every week who's looking at creating plant and investment and looks at Canada versus other jurisdictions in the world. And due to our regulatory environment, all of the issues that you named, overlapping regulations and non-competitive market, most of the time I'm hearing now that the decision is to invest elsewhere other than Canada. And that's probably the most disturbing thing with respect to our domestic food supply.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I guess that competitiveness comes on the regulatory and tax regime, as we've seen the carbon tax increased again. This would seem to be the most inopportune time to be increasing costs on your members. But for example, that would be in the regulatory regime as well. You're going to have to start dealing with front of pack labeling, which we've been told will be about a $2 billion cost to your members. Is that accurate? And what kind of an impact will that have at a time where certainly things are precarious, and I don't think you need to be facing additional costs and regulations? Can you maybe give us some insight on what the impact that will have at this time?
Certainly. Thank you for that question. The estimation of $2 billion overall as an industry as an impact for front of pack labeling alone is accurate. It's in the current competitive environment, we are looking at every possible input to our businesses rising dramatically, from front of pack labeling, whose timing is very difficult, especially after COVID, supply chain disruption, climate events, labor, and we're a very serious labor shortage in our industry. Each day, we are approximately 30,000 people short as an industry, and that number is expected to double by 2025 to 65,000. We need immediate relief with respect to labor. But back to your question on whether or not our industry is being affected by other factors in the regulatory environment, absolutely. Taxes are crippling for small business owners. And now we're looking at increased costs through transportation, through carbon taxing, through other environmental measures that are making investment in Canada incredibly difficult to defend. And inevitably, those owners and investors and leaders that are making those decisions are looking to other jurisdictions in the world. And that is a direct threat to our domestic food supply and consumers.
Thank you, Ms. Allen. Thank you, Mr. Barlow. We'll now turn to Mr. Drouin, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do want to thank the witnesses for being here with us. Ms. Allen, you've just touched on a few points, and we have debated this issue with how investors look at Canada, and we had a good conversation, good exchange between my colleague, Mr. Steinley, and Michael McCain in front of committee. And there was discussions about carbon tax and whether that was the sole purpose of the decision-making process of whether or not a company will decide to invest And Mr. McCain bluntly rejected that statement, saying there are multiple factors. Taxes are just a small portion of it. While important, it's a small portion of it. Proximity to primary goods, proximity to access to labor being important, and obviously trained labor is being important. So from your members' perspective, you say taxes is the most important perspective for investment, or because I'm looking at McCain, who's made a $680 million. There's a bunch of other companies out west that are making major investments. I'm just trying to get a good picture from your members' perspective of whether or not they're not making these particular investments because of that.
Thank you for that question. It's a very good question. And I would refer to economies of scale. The majority of my members are small and medium-sized enterprises, and they struggle with the time and investment it takes to apply for the government funding that is involved in a lot of these large plant and large-scale investments in Canada today. We're talking about mom and pop shops, multi-generational businesses, family businesses that aren't on the same scale. So when they go into work in the morning, they are looking at taxes, increased rising prices, and every input and every manufacturing input they have into their organization, increased costs for labor if they can access it, increased costs of transportation, overlapping regulation. It's an incredibly difficult competitive environment, and then layer on that the relationship they have with retailers and other hospitality sectors, which are our two major selling channels, as retail and food service sector, all of which are under the same strain. This is not unique to suppliers, and we're empathetic with the various value chain members that are dealing with the same issues as us. But your question was around investment, and the members that belong to FPC are generally small and medium-sized enterprises, family-owned, privately owned businesses that struggle every day to stay alive, to access labor, and those economies of scale that apply to Mr. McCain don't often apply to my members. It's a very difficult environment. So while I appreciate those comments, and they are relevant to his scale of business, again, the government funding that's easily accessed by virtue of being able to have the time and expertise to invest in the application process is very difficult for the mom and pop shop that have their hands on their operations each and every day.
Yeah, you talked about the blackout period before that, and would it be obviously there's no price increase and we've certainly learned that during our committee appearance that it's normal for prices at the retail not to go up during the Christmas period. But what's the relationship between and I've heard you say you're supportive of the code of conduct, so I'm assuming the majority of your members would be supportive of the code of conduct? Yes.
Yes, and thank you for that question.
Yeah.
My members are very supportive of the code of conduct, and I think your question was around the blackout period, if I understand it correctly, and that is a normal part of the retail cycle during the holiday season. No prices are passed on or increased, I'm sorry. It's very difficult for small and medium-sized enterprises to navigate that landscape if they have the need to raise their prices. They're not in control of what the consumer sees at retail. And they're bound by trade agreements if they have them. And a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises are not. They're experts in the production of their brand and their product, but they're not always experts in complicated and very detailed supply agreements, contractual agreements. And many of them don't have trade agreements. This is one of the areas that we hope to address by implementing a code of conduct, is to ensure that those trade agreements set forth the trade rules that outline when and how price increases can be achieved.
Well, the second follow-up to that was you've spoken about the Competition Act and the need to maybe modernize the Competition Act. Do you have any specific recommendations that would be favorable to your membership?
In about 30 seconds, unfortunately, Ms. Allen.
Certainly, that's a very complex question, and the ability to come back to that in a more meaningful and detailed way would be welcomed. We feel that the over-consolidation that's taken place in a number of sectors in the Canadian economy could be better managed by providing the Competition Bureau with more ability to investigate and have more transparency into the business dealings and consolidation that's taking place in the grocery sector specifically, because we are here to talk about food inflation. That would require an overhaul and a modernization of their ability to investigate and demand certain information from parties looking to consolidate. And we can look to other jurisdictions to look at ways in where we can prevent some organizations controlling more than a certain amount of the market share available in any particular area.
We're going to have to leave it there, Ms. Allen. Thank you, Mr.
Certainly.
Drouin. Maintenant, premièrement, bienvenue, Monsieur.
Now, Mr. Savard Tremblay, you have 5 minutes. Please, go ahead. Thank you for welcoming me, and hello to all my colleagues. Mr. Lynch, I will start with you. You told us about how people who are retired or who are about to retire have difficulty making the same purchases they used to at the grocery store. Do you think that an old age pension after 65 years old could be a solution? That could be an interesting measure, but there are other interesting solutions. Converting certain tax credits that are non-reimbursable, becoming reimbursable, that could be a solution. What we have to address is this entire situation. 25% of the population by 2030 will be over 65 years old. That will present a load of challenges. We will have a lot of poverty. Thank you for your specifications. It's good that you think that this is an interesting measure. Ms. Allen, from the Food Producers of Canada, you represent various companies. What are the comments that you hear the most amongst your members with regards to the increase of costs in the supply chain? What do your members and the companies that are part of your organization thinking about this?
Thank you for that question. When I speak to my members, I hear very common and recurring themes around supply chain risk and the exorbitant increases that they're facing in terms of warehousing, spacing, availability, price per square foot, even the ability to transport their goods to market. More than 70% of our industry needs to transport their goods from various locations, many of them rural, to transportation hubs across a couple of modes of transportation in order for those goods to reach market. That stands both domestically and for export. So they're looking at incredible increases and disruption in all modes of transportation, in particular the trucking industry. That is, again, they're looking at severe labor shortages as well. So when I speak to my members, it's largely around supply chain and then followed very quickly by government regulations, taxation, access to competitively priced inputs that they add value to and then create a product and get it to market. Labor, of course, is another huge issue, all under the understanding that supply chain is probably the biggest concern for them.
Merci pour votre réponse. Maintenant, on entend souvent de la part.
We often hear people from the agri-food sector talking about how the factories are too old. Automation is increasingly necessary and might be more prevalent in order to face the labor shortages, but apparently things are lagging. Do you think that the state should be investing in this sector?
Thank you. And yes, that's a very good point with respect to investment. In the last couple of years, maybe 3 years since the onset of the pandemic, the average small operator has had to invest unplanned capital into their operations to deal with everything COVID related, from PPE to infrastructure changes to health and safety measures to education to support for their employees. those all being unplanned and came at the trade-off of being able to modernize their plant and equipment, either through automation or various other investments that would make it more efficient within the plant walls or produce a safer product, or, like you say, replace some aspect of the manual labor that exists in the floor. Those come at an expense, and it would be a very welcomed indication from the government that you would be willing to invest and help our sector, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, with the type of investment that has been foregone in the last couple of years through all of the raises that we've seen in prices of inputs, as well as COVID management into the innovation and automation of our plants. I think that would create an immediate effect and a very strong return for our domestic food supply.
Merci, Madame Allen.
Thank you very much. A final question for the Consumers Council of Canada. We know that to have lower prices, we need less monopoly and more competitiveness. A team of witnesses told us that they would like to have, from the Competition Bureau, said that they would like to have data from various retailers. Would you recommend to the committee that they should give more powers to the Competition Bureau in order to, so that for them to be able to do their job properly?
The answer would be yes, or to some institution. We've suggested a Canadian consumer advocate because the Competition Bureau hasn't been very effective in implementing even some of the other acts it's responsible for, which we pointed out in our presentation. There doesn't seem to be an adequate culture of oversight and enforcement around a lot of marketplace issues. So we do have some concerns about the placement there of certain responsibilities, but for sure, we've advocated strongly in another forum that there are significant changes that need to happen to the Competition Act. And many of those kinds of changes might be a better way to provide support for smaller and medium-sized
Okay, we're going to leave it at
producers.
That, Mr. Whitehurst, we're going to leave it at that. Thank you so much. I gave about an extra minute to try to let the response play out. Thank you to both. Mr. Davies, up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Whitehurst. I think anybody who's been in a grocery store in the last 6 months would know exactly what you testified to about shrinkflation, and about how it seems like after food producers were caught drastically raising prices, they responded by then shrinking the quantities. I'm wondering if you could give me a bit of a sense of how ubiquitous or common that is.
Well, what we would say is, that's one thing that's happening. We're always conscious that, packaging sizes can be changed also because they fit needs in terms of consumer demand. It's not always the case that a package size changes just to optimize profit in terms of trickery. But it's been ubiquitous how many changes have been made. And we're definitely hearing from lots of consumers who are concerned about a wide range of gaming activities at retail. And they're really angry about it. And they're really angry at a time when inflation is high. And they also are very much questioning a lot of the public stories about what's happening with food prices, given that they're seeing certain things in their own purchasing, like fuel prices, relatively stabilizing, and yet we're continuing to see increases, and yet that transportation keeps getting cited as an increased cost. So there are lots of, maybe part of it is we're captured in the rhetoric of what happened, and now we have a future before us. But for sure, consumers are contacting us not only because they're angry about their own pocketbooks and feeling that their availability of competitive pricing is being denied to them. Seniors, for instance, shrinkflation is one problem, but another problem is we won't sell you anything but multiple units of a product at the lowest price. And so people are also angry about that. because there are some people who would like to buy smaller unit sizes, but the retail selling practices are denying them the opportunity to buy the product at a reasonable price. So,
sorry, Mr. Waiters, I have to jump in. I have a few other questions I want to ask you.
Yep.
In terms of, you mentioned about, I think you said Quebec is the only province that regulates unit pricing. Can you briefly explain how they do that, and do you have any suggestions about whether that should be adopted across the country?
Well, we do think it should be adopted across the country. We would point out that Canada's other major G7 or OECD trading partners pretty much have unit pricing, and they have unit pricing specifications so that you don't get the manipulation of how unit prices are presented at retail. And so there's a great opportunity to make it easier for people when they shop to look on shelf and be able to compare among products.
You mentioned favorably about you'd like to see some changes to the way the Competition Bureau implements competition policy. One specific suggestion that's been made is that the test be amended to no longer require that the Bureau prove that a firm acted with anti-competitive intent, but merely to prove that the actions had an anti-competitive effect. Is that something that you and your members would support?
Yes, because the concentration of ownership in a wide range of industries is so far over the mark in Canada that I think you're down to the core elements of whether competition is a method to protect consumers at all. We're certainly comfortable with the idea that competition should matter, but if you listen even to some of the testimony here today, we're talking about solving supply chain problems by having the supply chain, without involving consumers, organize how costs will be passed through to consumers. And it's sad that we're even at that point if we're serious about a competitive economy. But if we are at that point, and where we are at that point, our organization feels consumer representation should be substantially better. In the province of Ontario, for example, we have a monopoly in natural gas and effective distribution monopolies in electricity, and we have regulated pricing and application process, and our organization actively participates in those processes. If we can't do something about bringing competition into markets, then we have to look at what the regulatory offsets are to that. And even in places that we're currently regulated, the consumer representation capacity is very poor. So that's one reason we're advocating for a Canadian consumer advocate, not only to have an institution within government that's looking holistically at the interest of consumers, but also to create a connection to civil society to make sure civil society voices are heard, because that's sadly missing today.
Thank you, Mr. Whitehurst. Thank you, Mr. Davies. We'll go to Ms. Rood, and then we're coming back to the Liberals, and that'll be, unfortunately, the end of this panel, and we'll move on to our second panel. Ms. Rood, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Allen, you've appeared previously before this committee, and you said something I'm going to quote back to you, quote, "The threat of retailers' escalation of fees and fines places Canada's primary producers at risk as food processors purchase in excess of 40% of Canada's farm gate output," end quote. I'm wondering if you can tell us, has grocery price inflation caused food processors to purchase less?
Thank you very much for the question. I do not believe that what we're seeing take place in the marketplace has resulted in food producers purchasing less farm gate output. I don't have any data to support that. In fact, what's happened since the pandemic is that we've seen quite a bit more volume because people are at home, cooking more at home, drive more volume throughout the supply chain or the food value chain. So my concern for farm gate output is the same for many of the businesses in the value chain. They also are faced, according to reports that I'm receiving, with incredible pressures on everything from transportation of their goods through to fertilizer, through to the impact of the carbon tax, labor, all of those issues. Many of them are recurring throughout all the value chain. And if we are going to make the most of the opportunity ahead of us as a country, we need to address and understand the circumstances for each value chain member and its relationship between its both selling and production and how that product gets to market. We're not always in control of the pricing and whether or not we can control whether or not our product gets to market efficiently.
Thank you. And you just noted some of the limitations that food processors face, but I'm wondering if you could also comment on what kind of limitations food processors face when they're dealing with large grocery chains in the form of grocer fees and fines.
Certainly, and I'll try to bring it back to the small and medium-sized enterprise and usually the multi-generational families that are running them. So imagine you've done your best to produce a lot of goods according to a forecast provided to you by a retailer, and you have a trade agreement in place that states how much you will deliver and when. Those are delivered. You're not in control of when the truck gets there because that's a third party that does that. Also, your slot time in the warehouse is not something that you can control. So let's say that isn't perfectly aligned. And by the end of the time of delivery and the invoice that's provided, by the time that invoice is settled, usually with cash terms extending longer and longer as retailers prefer to hold on to the cash longer as part of their cash preservation strategy. By the time you get settlement for that payment or for that invoice, you're not always sure of what that payment will look like. So you can't count on your own cash flow planning and your own investment in your business to cover your expenses because you can't be certain that the $100, for example, that you've invoiced a retailer will be settled as $100 with all of those fees and fines and penalties eroding the settlement amount. You could be faced with 80 cents on that $1. So that makes it very difficult for small players to play. That's the environment that we are in. And then layer on all of the other environmental and economic factors and regulatory factors and taxes and access to competitively priced inputs. It's incredibly difficult for producers to have any level of certainty in their business dealings, and that's why we need the code.
Thank you. And as you know, I've also been a big proponent of the code for a number of years now. And one of the concerns that was raised, and you did touch on it a little bit earlier, was whether or not the code should include a completely transparent dispute resolution mechanism. And we just have about 30 seconds left. So I'm just wondering if you can touch on that and where we are in that process with the code.
Certainly. Where we are is relative to the major milestones that we need to achieve in the coming months. First is a broad-based industry consultation. So the code will go out for consultation. It'll be in the marketplace for up to 30 days, where we're soliciting the feedback of all stakeholders to ensure that we haven't overlooked any major item that needs more consideration, and also get other feedback on the principle-based nature of the code. We also are looking at an implementation date of January 2023. So after we gain the feedback from the consultation, it'll then be incumbent upon the steering committee to consider the dispute resolution mechanism, which is in its formation right now. And we have a very inclusive process that have retailers at the table, which was really important to have an industry-led solution and have a dispute resolution mechanism that allows for expedient resolution of issues and for a mechanism that identifies recurring themes. So in 18 months, the code can be revisited and improved upon, and there's a continuous improvement cycle.
Thank you, Ms. Allens. Thank you, Ms. Rood. Last question of the panel. I'm going to start with Ms. Valdez. You may be splitting your time with Mr. Lewis, but I'll leave that to you for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for joining our committee. I'll direct my questions through you, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Lynch. The Minister of Seniors, Minister Kamal Khera, has GIS in her mandate letter, and in that letter it says to increase GIS by $500 for single seniors and $750 for couples starting at age 65. This will help target the most vulnerable seniors in Canada, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Merci pour la question. Des mesures temporaires.
Thank you for the question. Temporary measures are welcome, but we do need long-term frameworks for seniors and more vulnerable people. What we need is an increase in the GIS. This is for people with the lowest incomes in Canada. Just as a reminder, people above 65 years old who only live off federal income are not earning more than $29,000 a year. So or $21,000 rather. Of course, this is not a lot of money. You can't pay for much. You can maybe buy the basics, but sometimes you have to make the decision between getting your medication or paying for your groceries or paying your rent. So it's a very precarious situation. We're talking about 25% of the population, 40% out of more than 1 million seniors in Quebec. I'm sure it's a similar ratio for the rest of Canada.
And thank you so much. And just some of the things that you had mentioned in your opening, we know seniors are on a fixed income with their pension. Are there any recommendations you wanted to put forward that you didn't cover in your opening?
Je vais juste répéter ce que j'ai dit tantôt, c'est que
I'll just repeat what I said. We have to take all measures to increase the income of seniors and those who have the smaller revenues amongst seniors through finances and by fiscal measures and the SRG that we can implement efficient measures. We have to do this quickly. There are increases in the cost of living. Incomes are lowering. The indexation is never appropriate. Society is impoverishing itself over time. The most vulnerable people will soon reach the level of people who are a little bit higher up. There are people, seniors helped build this society, and we should give them revenue that is appropriate and dignified.
Thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. I'd like to direct my questions to Mr. Whitehurst on behalf of the Consumers Council of Canada. As you represent consumers, we've had a lot of discussion up until now through this study on the issue of trust between consumers and the major grocery chains. Do you feel this is a major issue facing consumers right now? And if so, do you believe that the Grocery Code of Conduct will address this? Or do you think that's going to deal primarily with the relationship between the producers, the farmers, the producers, and the grocery chains?
We're shockingly seeing, and we're not the only ones, when we've measured it and others measure it, we just see that trust in business and government is plummeting. And marketplace practices are a big part of that. For sure, we don't think that any major consumer group has been included in any of the discussions about supply chain codes. And where there there are practices in place, like in Canada's marketing boards, agricultural products marketing boards. The consumer voice is extremely weak. We're not an organization that, will discredit one process or another on philosophy alone. It needs to be judged by its performance. And we're hearing from everyone, including supply chain people, that there are big problems of trust. Part of it is, concentration of ownership problems. Part of it is international forces. This is one of the reasons, we didn't focus on the bigger question of inflation. There are lots of sources of inflation right now. We instead would say, okay, so you give people more financial assistance to help them in the marketplace. But if the marketplace itself is stripping them of consumer surplus assertively, because it's not a competitive marketplace and because consumers don't have a voice, you're wasting your money. So I think
quick
it's
follow-up.
time for a rebalance.
Okay,
If
just one
you
quick
want
follow-up,
consumers' trust back.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Whitehurst. And one quick follow-up.
Yep.
Which of the recommendations that you've made in your presentation do you think will go furthest towards reestablishing that trust between the consumer and the grocers?
Yeah, well, we think at the very fundamental level, not just in this sector, but in every sector, that there is really a problem of there is no whole of government approach to looking at the consumer's interest in any of these questions. I mean, the reason for having competition policy is to protect consumers. The reason for having health policy is to protect
Mr. Whitehurst,
consumers.
we're
You
at
can go
time.
down the
Mr.
list.
Whitehurst,
So
Mr.
we would
White-
say the Canadian consumer.
Mr. Whitehurst, excuse me. When I intervene, I need
Yeah.
you to stop. Honestly, as a witness,
Yes.
as the chair, we're at significant overtime. I listened and certainly wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity, but you were going on quite of a deep opining of that subject. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to finish up, and then we need to be able to move on. Thank you. Over to you.
I have no need to finish up. I apologize. It was simply that until you spoke, I didn't realize my time was up.
No worries. Thank you very much, Mr. Whitehurst. Thank you, Ms. Taylor-Roy. Colleagues, that, unfortunately, because of time constraints, ends our first panel. But let me thank, on behalf of all the committee, Monsieur Lynch, the association, with the Association Québécoise de défense des droits des personnes retraitées et prétraitées, from Consumer Council of Canada, Mr. Whitehurst, thank you for being here today, and from Food Producers of Canada, Ms. Allen, thank you for contributing to our study. Colleagues, don't go far. We're just going to be a few minutes, and we're going to be getting back with our second panel. Thank you so much. All right, colleagues, we're going to get back started. Thank you so much for your patience and the turnaround. We have the second panel. Ms. Rude, we can talk about appointments and all that stuff between you and Mr. Duran another time, but right now we got to get to business. First of all, thank you, colleagues. This is our last but not least, because the folks that we have here today, I'm looking forward to this panel. We've had a great study, but looking forward to hearing from these folks. From La Table de Chef, we have Jean-François Archambault, fondateur et directeur général. Bienvenue à la comité. Groupe Nutri, Sébastien Léveillé.
Welcome to the committee.
Who's Executive Director and General Counsel, joining us online. And we have Amy Hill in the room. And let me say that Amy Hill is a graduate of Dalhousie Law School, the best law school in the country. So very good to see you, Ms. Hill. We're going to have up to 5 minutes. Colleagues, based on the bells, by the time we get done, it's going to be about 5:20. The bells are expected at 5:40. I propose that we just do 1 6-minute round for each party. And then we'll have to extend it just a few minutes beyond the bells, but then we'll let everyone go. This is a confidence vote. It is important, so I think we should make sure that we're there. Of course, Steve McKinnon would be proud of me. I also want to recognize Mr. Shields in replace of Mr. Barlow today. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Shields. We're going to start with Monsieur Archambault. Vous avez 5 minutes. Allez-y.
Mr. Archambault, you have 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity of sharing my vision and some details on the issue of food inflation. I have 5 children. I'm the father of 5. They are in every age group, 15, 12, 9, and 3-year-old twins. Like all Canadians, I have noticed the increase in food prices. Of course, our grocery basket has increased in cost drastically. That said, when you know how to cook and you know how to recuperate and reduce waste and, of course, conserve and preserve food, and when you cook a lot, you can reach some sort of a balance. When I see how much food costs, I, of course, analyze many things. I was in Toronto yesterday for an activity on food waste, and I was in a grocery store. I was participating with certain activities, with certain companies, and we recuperated food that had not been sold by a grocery store that would have been sent to compost, which were perfectly good to consume. Of course, today, when you see temporary situations, for example, the price hikes in certain specific food items like lettuce or broccoli that cost $5 yesterday for just a small head of broccoli that would not have fed my family of 7, well, I don't know many people who would have bought that head of broccoli. If the products are expensive, they will be wasted. They will stay on the grocery store shelves. They won't be consumed. They will not be sold, and that will increase food waste. That's my first observation. Then I'd like to talk about the impact on people who have financial issues. I was in Calgary, Toronto, and Quebec recently. There are a lot of people who are food insecure right now. I have been working in this field for 20 years. In the past 6 months, I can tell you that it is very obvious. It's very concerning. The situation is making a lot of people vulnerable. And I have many colleagues who are frontline managers, and they share this issue with me every day. We are in touch with more than 200 organizations that we've been working with through the pandemic, soup kitchens, for example, across Canada. The situation is worrisome. Another element I'd like to bring to your attention is the following. It's important to develop knowledge and developing food knowledge and skills at an early age. I graduated from the hotel institution from Quebec, and I know how to welcome people at home. I know how to invite people over, but I also know how to cook for large groups of people and how to cook to reduce food waste. There are many chefs who feed people in precarious situations. The chefs that I have been able to mobilize for this movement work across 200 schools across Quebec to develop food knowledge and skills of youth. La Table des Jeunes works mostly in Quebec, but also in other provinces, in both English and French, in both official languages, in many regions across Canada. Right now, it's difficult for us to expand. I look at the policy on food literacy, and I am really waiting with bated breath for more investment to help youth in schools. Thank you very much. Oh, to finish? Oh, thank you very much. I suppose we'll have more time later. There is a bit of a delay, and I thought that you were finished, but it is the end of your allocated time. Mr. Léveillé, in person, 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the committee.
I'd like to extend my greetings to all the members of Nutri Group across Canada. Although for the purpose of clarity for this committee, the remainder of my presentation will be in French. Au nom des centaines de fermiers propriétaires qui
On behalf of the hundreds of farmers, owners who make up Nutri Group, I am pleased to come before you today to help you paint the most accurate picture possible of the health of the egg industry in general and the mechanics of pricing in particular. Like you, I am aware of the inflation that is occurring here as it is elsewhere. However, our industry offers a unique perspective on the realities of places under supply management, which have been more protected from major fluctuations, and those of countries where the market is totally free, and where today the market price for a dozen eggs is much higher than in Canada. Supply management provides predictability in our supply chain, supports good jobs, and provides quality food guaranteed by rigorous and audited food safety and animal care programs. Canada's supply management system, as demonstrated during the pandemic, ensured that Canadian families had access to safe, affordable, and locally produced food without border and foreign supply chain issues. Eggs are a widely consumed product that is part of the daily lives of millions of Canadians. It is a staple for Canadian families. Nutri Group is one of Canada's leading egg graders and processors with its head office in Saint-Hyacinthe, Quebec. We employ more than 500 workers in 7 units and partnerships. Nutri Group is first and foremost the farm families in the Maritimes, Quebec, Ontario, and the Prairies. Together, we supply over 1.5 billion eggs per year. Our combined production allows us to serve Canadian customers, retailers, restaurants, hotel networks, and institutions. In Quebec, as in the rest of Canada, there is a framework around the egg industry which allows for land to be used dynamically, with our farms often being located in rural areas, allowing us to take advantage of the space and infrastructures that are there to support the local economies. The popularity of our product and its key role in the food supply chain means that it is often on sale, and therefore the pressure on the price is more often bearish than bullish. The costing mechanism for eggs is organized and regulated. Our role in setting retail prices is limited. In fact, it is based on 3 components. First, the farm gate price determined by supply management. Second, our operational costs, and I assure you that we are working hard to control these costs as much as possible. And 3, the retailer or restaurant responsible for setting the selling price according to their desired margin. If I wish to increase prices, I must notify the major companies 3 months prior to the date of the desired increase. Then I must provide all the justifications for the price increase and explain why it is necessary for us. You'll understand that there are forces beyond our control, such as rising production costs, shortages in production costs, labor shortages that affects our sector like many others, and in some cases even the avian flu, which is currently affecting our industry. The logistics of serving a market such as Canada's are broad, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank the producers and all the stakeholders along this very long chain from the farm to the table. Nevertheless, thanks to our processes that aim to increase efficiency, our prices fluctuate slowly, and this is to the benefit of Canadians. In 2022, the price fluctuated by 8.4% in our industry compared to 2021. That's a lot, but less than the 9.2% for the rest of the food chain. A majority of you have probably eaten eggs in the last few days or even today. At Nutri Group, since 1985, we have been the vehicle for bringing eggs from the farm to Canadian consumers' tables. Therefore, we have a responsibility both to those who consume them and those who produce them. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Léveillé. Now we have Mr. Lawford or Ms. Hill for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and honorable members. My name is John Lawford, and I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel at the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, and I'm joined today by PX articling student Amy Hill, and for the technicians and members, we will be sharing the speaking. PIAC is a national not-for-profit and registered charity, and we provide legal and research services on behalf of consumer interests, and in particular vulnerable consumer interests, concerning the provision of important public services and products, and PIAC has been active in the field of consumer protection and policy for over 40 years. Amy?
Supports the government's grocery rebate in Budget 2023, which provides much-needed financial support to 11 million low and modest income Canadians and families. The grocery rebate is a one-time payment and a step in the right direction, but more ongoing relief is needed for consumers and vulnerable consumers in particular. Food Banks Canada reported a 35% increase in total food bank visits between 2019 and 2022. Canadian research has indicated, however, that only 20 to 30% of people experiencing food insecurity seek charitable food assistance. Research also suggests that some of those who access food assistance still report going hungry. Stigma was cited as one of the reasons why people are not seeking help from food banks. Given this, it is likely that the negative impacts of food inflation on food security are even worse than food bank statistics may suggest. This is important for two reasons. First, food insecurity has important ties to both physical and mental health. Second, food insecurity disproportionately impacts certain populations, including those with disabilities, racialized people, newcomers, and people with precarious immigration statuses, many of whom are already facing structural oppressions in our society. In February, Mr. McCann testified before this committee that food inflation is regressive, hitting poor households harder. He testified that policy solutions should be directed at those Canadians who need the help most. PIAC agrees. The federal government should consider extending the grocery rebate and consider other targeted income supplements to vulnerable consumers who need help most during the inflationary period and beyond. John?
This committee has heard extensive testimony about the grocery codes of conduct. We understand that the testimony that this code is needed to govern the relationship between suppliers and grocers. PIAC does not oppose a code. PIAC is supportive of a code so far as it provides benefits to consumers, such as increased supply chain resiliency and, in the long run, more innovative products. What we are concerned with, however, is the new financial dynamics under a code that could impact consumer retail pricing. Mike Van Masso, an associate professor at the University of Guelph, described the pricing dynamics in the grocery code of conduct as a zero-sum game. And that is, if suppliers make more money by either facing fewer fees or less price pressure, then either grocers will make less or consumers will pay more. Something has to give, and it's not likely to be grocers' profits. On March 8th, Mr. Perron briefly questioned witnesses on the idea of a review of a code 1 year following implementation. PIAC is supportive of post-implementation review. and would add that any review should not only consider how the code has impacted industry relationships, but also consider whether the code has impacted retail prices for consumers. Innovative products are interesting, but food affordability must be prioritized. Amy.
The Competition Bureau in response to their market study on the grocery industry. There were a couple issues we flagged with the Bureau and that we would also put before the committee today, which had either direct or indirect impacts to food pricing. First, access to consumer data and the ability to process and use data from loyalty programs is a significant competitive advantage in the grocery industry. Purchasing data about a consumer allows the grocers to build profiles about consumers and then use the profiles for targeted advertising. In the interest of time, I will just note that if Bill C-27 passes in its current form, consumers could lose important legislative protections when it comes to their data, leaving data more vulnerable even as grocers collect more from points programs. Secondly, while this is a federal committee, the committee should also consider regional challenges, whether that be food affordability in the far north or restrictive covenants in some southern communities. Many Canadian communities have unique challenges when it comes to food, and we hope the recommendations in the committee's report we hope to see recommendations acknowledging these distinct challenges. John?
We're supportive of the committee's study to examine food inflation, and we hope that this ultimately results in more support for vulnerable consumers. Thanks very much, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. It's not often that we have the back and forth, but I think it was a good, unique bit, and it was right on time. So, as your chair, I'm quite happy about that. Colleagues, as I mentioned, we're going to go for 24 minutes, so six minutes each party. Monsieur Lehoux, s'il vous plaît, allez-y.
Mr. Lehoux, thank you to the witnesses for being with us this afternoon. First question for Mr. Léveillé. You have production which is regulated across Canada. With regards to the market, are there still independent producers? What percentage of production is produced by Nutri Group in Quebec? And is there something in Canada, a comparative in Canada? We do have a lot of independent producers still who don't participate in Nutri Group. That's, of course, 40% of our provisions that are not participants, but they are providers. And they are subject to the same rules and regulations as others shareholders. You are a very big and important group. Is that a positive? Probably that's positive when it comes to negotiating with retailers. Can you talk about the price that is paid for a dozen eggs by a client and how much is going to the farmer? Can you give us a percentage? With regards to for confidentiality issues and competitive prices, you know the price of a dozen eggs. It's $2.49 in Quebec. Or $3.49 rather. There are a lot of prices that are varying everywhere. There are a lot of sales and promotions. This happens year-round with eggs. Sometimes the prices are quite aggressive, and it is a product that draws people to the store. We have been going through this in a recurring manner for a number of years. So the profit margin is difficult to establish because of that. There are so many promotions that it varies too much and it's hard to say. If there was no producer, there would be no eggs on the table. Are they getting a decent price for the production? Does it respect everything? Well, supply management is a great advantage. It allows Canadians to have a fair price, and it allows farming families to have fair incomes. You mentioned in other countries this kind of system doesn't exist, and a dozen eggs is a lot higher than what Canadians pay. Indeed, if You can see what's going on in the United States. For example, the price of eggs is a lot higher than it is in Canada. And during the inflation period, but also during the avian flu period. This is an issue in North America, but also worldwide. Now you're drawing me to the next topic, which is avian flu, which of course has an impact on production. If there's a difficulty with regards to production, of course there will be an increase in price. And consumers will pay the price. Do you think that controlling avian flu in Canada is going well? Well, supply and demand increased prices in the United States. Supply management is dealt differently in Canada. It is very well controlled in Canada. Even if we were impacted by the avian flu, we have a situation that is efficient in Canada to maintain prices that are decent for clients and Canadians. Mr. Archambault, you talked about food insecurity linked to food waste. You are already participating with 250 schools in Quebec, and you're also participating in other provinces across Canada. How could this committee help you further in order to improve the education with regards to food waste? First of all, thank you. It's important that I even have the time to talk to you about it and that you are listening to me. That is already very positive. It's important to think about the consumer of the future when we talk about food autonomy in Quebec. We're often thinking about what's going on now, but we must think quickly about the next generation. Teenagers in high schools right now will be making decisions very soon as consumers. We need to carve out a space for them. Talking to you about it, of course, allows me to give voice to this issue. Hopefully, it also allows me to amplify this movement that is being created in Canada to develop the food knowledge of youth and making them able to make their own decisions. When you have to restrict your food budget, you have to have the necessary tools to do so. And that is part of food knowledge and skill building. Do you have a specific recommendation that you can make to expand La Table des Chefs in the province and across Canada? 20 seconds, please, Mr. Archambault. Minister Bibeau and Minister Gould talked about a universal food plan in schools in which food education would be included. Those recommendations should be accelerated by the government. We are talking about it, and it's a transparent discussion. I'd like to see which discussions are being taken so that I can participate in these discussions. Many schools, we want to ensure food security for children in schools and develop their literacy, food literacy. Thank you, Mr. Lehoux. Thank you. And now Mr. Louis, who will be sharing his time with Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Chair, thank you to all the witnesses. Like I said, I'll be splitting my time with Ms. Taylor-Roy. So I'll focus my questions on Mr. Levier. You mentioned off the top supply management, how much that protects the price fluctuations. It offers that predictability. You used the words safe, affordable, and locally produced. Nutri-Group, you also mentioned egg graders and processors, 7 locations. One of the locations is minutes from my house. It's, I believe, the parent company of Ontario Pride Eggs, which is in Kitchener, as am I. That facility has local producers are selling, and you're cleaning, grading, and packaging the eggs. So on our food price inflation study here, we talked about, you mentioned in your opening statement the costing mechanism, the 3 steps, the farm gate prices controlled in part by supply management, which offers that less price fluctuation, the operational costs of yourself, and then the retail setting prices for their margin. So what I'd like to focus on is the operational costs. The logistics of having your plants closer to producers and to customers. With those 7, can you explain how that helps keep your costs down?
Merci pour la question. Effectivement, vous avez raison. Le fait d'avoir...
Indeed, you are correct. The fact that there are places next to farms in Canada help us with proximity. Of course, we were subjected to the same rules as others with regards to inflation, but you're correct. The fact that we have local producers across Canada helps us to keep proximity with our farms and to not be too far from our farms. That is one of the strengths of supply management in Canada. We know where all of the markets are across Canada.
Also, we talked about the relationship between our farmers and production. You have a wonderful relationship with, and I can speak from this, with the farmers locally, most of whom are actually shareholders in the company. Can you tell us, because we've heard some horror stories about relationships, can you tell us that relationship that you have when the farmers themselves and the producers are also shareholders?
L'histoire de Nutri est assez exceptionnelle dans la mesure où
producers or egg producers at some point decided to have an economic structure so that their products can reach consumers' tables. And Nutri-Group was created by them and highlighted eggs. They innovated, and it brought eggs to the table. This is the story of Canadian farmers who built this organization.
Thank you, and thank you to all our witnesses for participating. I'd like to direct my question to PIAC, and perhaps since you're in the room, Ms. Hill, you could answer my question. I noticed your main recommendation to do with the increase in food prices is really to increase or continue the support for the most vulnerable. And while I agree with this, and certainly our government does with the GST rebate and many other support programs that we've put in place since 2015, targeted to those who need it most, I noticed that there were not any specific recommendations to combat high grocery prices. I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts on what could be done to actually bring grocery prices down.
Yeah, definitely, and thank you. Great question. As this committee has heard, there's a lot of different things that contribute to inflation throughout the supply chain and kind of result in some of the prices that we're seeing at retail. So we decided to focus our recommendations on more of the demand side because our interest group is consumers at the end of the day. But we would highlight that there's a really important role for competition law to play in kind of those prices that we see at retail, and we hope that there will be some improvements to the Competition Act that will allow some more enforcement in the industry.
Thank you. And Mr. Lawford, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just that we have had years of mergers in the grocery industry, and we're sort of reaping the benefit now, such that retailers can raise prices in a more comprehensive and quicker fashion than if there were more competitors. That's basically our bottom line.
Thank you. And do you think having more local food producers, having more sustainable, agriculture locally, that could help address some of these problems as well?
Yes, that would take some put some pricing pressure on the majors and also give more variety to consumers and support local business, keep dollars in the community. Amy, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, just one thing. It sounds like transportation costs have been a really big challenge for the industry throughout this inflationary period. So obviously, the more local food is, the lower the transportation cost is. So hopefully that will help.
Great, thank you. And just regarding the transportation costs, fuel costs, we've heard a lot about the food inflation being caused by the price on pollution. The price on pollution did not increase between April of 22 and April of 23, and yet I believe that was the period of highest inflation in food prices. Do you feel there were other factors contributing to food inflation in that period?
That's a bit of a fraught question. My instinct is to think that there is some profit taking on behalf of the grocery retailers rather than it being increased fuel costs. But Amy, do you want to add anything?
No, I think the only thing I would add is that we are supportive of the carbon tax, despite acknowledging that fuel costs potentially has increased for the industry.
Thank you very much, and I think I'm out of time.
You are. Thank you, Ms. Taylor-Roy, Ms. Hill, and Mr. Lawford. Maintenant, Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, s'il vous plaît, 6 minutes.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes. Thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. My male chauvinism will bring me to question Nutri-Group, since you are located in my very riding. I feel it right at home. You purchase eggs, you distribute them in grocery stores. There are increases, but where are the increases located? Thank you for the question. At many levels, I've heard that there are costs related to transportation. Here's a reality with regards to labor. When we talk about labor shortages, those are related to the fact that there are factories that need a very high level of efficiency, so they have to be at full capacity. And so when there's a labor shortage, the factories have slowed down, and that's why we need very specific recruiting programs. And that was a very important element with regards to cost increases. Since we're talking about factories, are the installations up to snuff? Do you need some help from the state? That is always welcome, of course. The factories, of course, went through automation processes across Canada. That was part of the solutions to help with labor shortages. There is, of course, a limit with what we could do with regards to capital when we're lacking capital, but this did help. So do you think that there is something, you think that there could be a bit more to do that will have an impact on what we're talking about today? Yes, the labor shortage, when we're improving the automation, would help. You talked about the avian flu earlier. That is an important issue. With regards to packaging, is there anything that we could do? I'd say that avian flu had more to do with the biosafety of farms. Canada is well equipped to deal with that. But if you're talking about inflation, packaging was indeed affected by the increase in prices, cartons, and also the plastic wrap and the pulp. All of that is part of the inflation. So is there anything that we can do quickly with regards to packaging? Or off the top of your head, rather? Well, we don't produce packagings. We're not experts, so we'd have to ask them. We don't want to establish competition between our producers, but I'm not an expert on packaging. Do you think that the cost of eggs is relatively stable, but are you absorbing any costs so that consumers can continue to have affordable eggs. Like many industries, the fact that inflation happened so quickly in the past 12 months makes it obvious that groups like Nutri-Group absorb some of the costs. It was so quick that it was impossible for us to react and to increase prices quickly. My next question is for the Public Interest Advocacy Center, Mr. Lawford, Ms. Hill. We're very happy that you supported the idea of my colleague Yves, who I am replacing today, Yves Perron. We're happy that you supported his recommendation. Here's a question that I asked during the first hour of this committee. We know that more competition and less monopoly gives better prices. That is a universal rule. At the Competition Bureau, the team of witnesses said that the Bureau didn't have enough teeth and in order to access specific data. Do you think that the Competition Bureau should have more powers? In the first hour, I asked the same question to the Consumers' Council of Canada, or do you think that we should create a different body in Canada, which exists in Quebec but not federally, that could help with that? Thank you for the question. I will begin. With regards to whether the Competition Bureau has enough teeth, we have already made recommendations, and we reviewed them in March. The Bureau does not have the power or the right to go get data directly from suppliers. So this will help. With regards to the consumers' protection, PIAC does not support that solution because that incurs some difficulties. We have some agencies who are already present for consumers in specific sectors. If it is necessary, then we should just work with groups like our own before creating a different government body. I think that's all for our question. Thank you, Mr. Lawford. Mr. Savard-Tremblay.
We've talked about this. I just need to extend for another 10 minutes. Everyone will still be able to get to the House. Mr. Davies, we're going to go to you. Assuming we have unanimous consent, this committee works pretty good. Not seeing any issues. Mr. Davies, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Lawford, Ms. Hill, I'll start with you. In a recent submission to the Competition Bureau's Retail Grocery Market Study, the Public Interest Advocacy Center highlighted the negative effects that so-called restrictive covenants may have on competition in the sector. I think you touched on that in your remarks. As Mr. Anthony DeRoche, Deputy Commissioner of the Competition Promotion Branch of the Bureau, explained, supermarkets sometimes place these covenants in real estate lease agreements to prevent other food retailers from using the same store location in the future. Can you explain to us what effect these restrictive covenants have on competition in the food retail sector and maybe what you think we should do about it?
Amy is our expert on that. I'll leave it to her.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I think you characterize restrictive covenants very well. They are a private law tool, which causes quite a challenge in discovering them. As you noted, they have been discovered in both Alberta and Nova Scotia. One of the things that we challenge the Competition Bureau to do is examine how they can use their powers in the context of competition to address these restrictive covenants. Because restrictive covenants deal with property, that's generally a provincial matter, so that's a bit of a challenge there, but we've challenged them to consider how competition powers could be used to address those, because ultimately, in terms of how they impact competition, I mean, they prevent grocers from moving into that space. So they ultimately are a barrier to entry for new grocers or a barrier to entry for existing grocers into a market.
Would you say, Ms. Hill, that such restrictive covenants, at least on a prima facie basis contravene the Competition Act? Or would that be the argument that would be made?
That would be the argument that would be made, yes.
Thank you. A more general, maybe philosophical question to both of you. I was Googling your website, and it says that the purpose of your organization is to protect consumer interests in regulated industries such as telecommunications, energy, financial services, privacy, and transportation. Now, I don't see food there. Now, food seems to me to be about as essential as energy might be. Should food be more vigorously regulated in this country, in your view?
I'll take that one, and I would say yes. There are a number of sectors in Canada that don't have a dedicated regulator, and grocery and food is one of them. For example, the Code of Conduct, which, as we said, we do support in principle, for example, neither our group nor any other consumer group, to my knowledge, is sitting around the table with the grocers and suppliers. So there's always a risk that you're going to have consumer interests lose in that kind of situation, and a dedicated regulator and some regulations are a way for consumers to get to be part of that regulation making and have a say. So we would support any new regulation or regulator in this space.
Thank you, Monsieur Lavalier. Would you say that the supply management has been relatively successful in terms of regulating prices while stabilizing production in your sector?
Je vous dirais sans aucun doute, absolument.
I would say without a doubt, if you consider or take into consideration the past year's situation especially, you should look at the situation in the United States. We had avian flu in North America, and the supply management system was very robust in Canada and allowed us to maintain adequate prices for consumers in Canada.
Thank you. So we know that the three pillars of supply management are production discipline, cost of production pricing, and import controls, the famous three pillars. And so far as I know, I think there's three major sectors of supply management in Canada. There's eggs, milk, and chicken, turkey, referred to as poultry. So in your view, should this successful model of that provides Canadians with quality products, stable production for producers, fair prices for consumers and producers, should that be expanded to other agricultural food products in Canada?
C'est une excellente question.
It's an excellent question. I think that the answer would be very long. I think Canadian productions have very different situations. So I'll demonstrate my expertise in eggs today, I guess. I do think that Canada has a responsibility internationally. There are certainly issues with regards to the pillars of supply management with regards to eggs. They're very, very much to the benefit of our population, that is without a doubt.
So I know you have a lot to say on it, and we don't have as much time, but I'm just wondering, it's illogical to think that supply management would only be successful for those three products. And we have a food crisis in this country and many other commodities. I'm just wondering what other products or commodities might be good candidates in your view. Have you ever given any thought to that, or is there...
30 secondes, s'il vous plaît. 30 secondes.
C'est difficile pour moi de répondre sur cet aspect-là parce que chaque...
Every agri-food sector has its own realities and financial realities and advantages internationally. For example, there is an economic or financial ecosystem for each production sector, and they all need exports in certain cases. So it's very difficult for me to answer that question. What I can say is that with regards to what you've mentioned, the products you've mentioned with meat and so on, is very beneficial to Canada, for Canadians, because we do control some of the import. But so it's very difficult to answer.
Going to be very quick. Just first of all, to the public interest organization that's here, Public Interest Advocacy Center, I'm going to ask two questions. We don't have time for your responses, but I would welcome any type of written correspondence to this committee. The Consumer Council of Canada, in the first panel, talked about the idea of creating a food consumer advocate. Would welcome your thoughts on whether or not that's a good idea. I recognize that you're already doing some in this space, but to Mr. Davies' point, maybe not specific to food. And Mr. Lawford, you just talked about the idea of some type of regulated entity or regulator. I would welcome your thoughts on whether or not that is in the federal jurisdiction, or because if it's at point of sale, it's actually more of a provincial. So anything you can provide in writing to this group, that would be wonderful. Colleagues, thank you for coming here early. Let me thank the witnesses again, Mr. Lavillet, Madame Hill, Mr. Lawford, and Mr. Archambault. Just two quick things. Ms. Koch was not able to attend from gifts. There was some type of either a personal reason why she couldn't or a technical issue, I don't know. But I'm asking for your unanimous consent to allow her speaking notes to be admitted as evidence. I think that's pretty reasonable so that it could be considered. Okay, seeing no issue there. The only other thing is on deadlines. We are working to go towards animal biosecurity preparedness under Mr. Liu. We were working to try to get a deadline today. If that hasn't happened, I would ask by tonight, at the latest tomorrow morning, please get your witnesses to the clerk. And my apologies if that wasn't communicated very clearly in the past. And we're also working on food price inflation. Of course, this is our last panel. But we do have our analysts working hard to make sure that that can be prepared. So as you work on recommendations, the goal is to have that this week. So please get that to our analysts, please, and thank you. Colleagues, I'll let you get over to the House with 19 minutes to spare. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.